No one had ever heard laughter in Richard Hale's mansion until the day his maid showed up with her twins. What happened next? It changed everything, and no billionaire could have predicted it. No one had ever heard laughter inside Richard Hale's mansion. Not once. Not a giggle, not a whisper of joy, not the echo of a single child's voice bouncing off the marble walls. For years, the billionaire lived in what people called a palace of silence. Everything about the mansion was perfect, but lifeless. The floors gleamed like glass. The chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars. The garden was trimmed with mathematical precision. Yet beneath all that beauty was something colder than winter: emptiness. Richard Hale was known across the city as a genius businessman, the man who turned a small construction company into a billion-dollar empire. His face was often on magazine covers, his name whispered with admiration at charity galas. But behind closed doors, he was a ghost. He didn't host parties. He didn't visit friends. He didn't smile for cameras anymore. And there was one rule every worker in that mansion knew by heart: no noise. No chaos. No memories. Because once upon a time, this mansion had been full of life. There was laughter in the hallways, music from the piano room, and the sweet smell of cookies that his wife, Clara, loved to bake every Sunday. Clara was his everything. She had a way of making the world feel lighter. She'd dance barefoot in the kitchen, sing terribly off-key, and somehow still make Richard laugh so hard he'd forget the business calls piling up. But life, cruel as it can be, took her away far too soon. One rainy evening, 10 years ago, Clara had been on her way home from an orphanage charity event, a place she adored because she loved children and dreamed of having her own. But a car speeding through a red light ended all of it in a heartbeat. That night, Richard's world went silent. He stopped listening to music. He removed every photo of her from the walls. The piano she used to play was locked and covered with a white sheet. And from that moment on, Richard Hale buried his heart with her. To his staff, he wasn't cruel, just broken. He never raised his voice, never got angry. He was just cold. A man who lived more in his office than in his home. The maids worked in silence. The gardener trimmed in silence. Even the chef learned to cook without sound, because everyone feared disturbing the silence that seemed sacred to him. The mansion became a place where time itself felt trapped. Every clock ticked quietly. Every step echoed like a whisper in a cathedral of sorrow. No one dared talk about her. And definitely no one dared talk about children. Until the day Grace arrived. She came on a gray Monday morning, the kind of day where the clouds hung low and the air felt heavy. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with a warmth that seemed completely out of place in that cold mansion. The agency had sent her as a replacement for the old housemaid who had retired. The staff greeted her with polite smiles, but also quiet warnings. Don't sing. Don't laugh too loud. Mr. Hale doesn't like noise. And never mention kids. Ever. Grace listened carefully, nodding, but deep inside, she didn't understand how anyone could live like that. Because for her, noise was life. Grace came from a small town, far from the city lights and luxury of Hale Mansion. Life had never been easy for her. Her husband had left years ago, and she was raising 2 children all on her own, Mia and Noah, her 5-year-old twins. They were her world. Every morning, before leaving for work, she'd kiss their foreheads, whisper, "Be good, Mommy loves you," and promise to come back with a smile. And every evening, no matter how tired she was, she'd rush home to cook for them, bathe them, and tell them bedtime stories. Stories about courage, kindness, and dreams coming true. Stories she wanted them to believe in, even if life wasn't fair to her. But inside Hale Mansion, Grace felt something strange. She couldn't explain it at first. It wasn't fear, it was sadness. The air in that house felt heavy, like it carried grief that refused to leave. Even as she dusted the furniture or cleaned the vast dining hall, she could feel eyes watching her, not literally, but through the paintings of Clara that still hung in some corners. A woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. Grace couldn't help but pause sometimes and whisper, "You must have been special. He still keeps your world frozen." On her third day, as she dusted the grand piano in the ballroom, she caught her reflection in its glossy, black surface. It was covered, untouched for years. Her fingers brushed over the cloth, and for a brief second, she wanted to lift it, to let the sunlight hit the keys again. But she stopped herself. The butler's voice echoed in her head. He doesn't like reminders. So she simply whispered, "Maybe one day, someone will bring music back here again." She didn't know that someone would be her, or that her children would be the ones to melt the ice around Richard Hale's heart. That evening, when her shift ended, Grace packed her things quickly. She hated staying late. Her twins would be waiting, probably fighting over crayons or complaining they were hungry again. She smiled just thinking about them. As she stepped out of the mansion, she saw a group of children laughing and playing on the street outside the gate. Their carefree joy echoed faintly through the iron bars. And for the first time, she wondered, what would Richard Hale do if he heard that sound? Would he yell? Would he frown? Or would something inside him remember? She didn't know the answer. But soon she would. Because fate was already writing the next chapter. The one where silence would finally break, and laughter would return to the house that forgot how to love. The storm had been raging for hours. Rain lashed against the windows of the Hale mansion like 1,000 tiny hammers, and the wind howled through the trees, bending them until they seemed like shadows in a nightmare. Inside the mansion, the usual silence felt heavier than ever. Even the old grandfather clock seemed to tick quietly out of respect for the storm. Grace was frantic. She had planned her day carefully. Leave work at 5, make it home in time for the twins' dinner, bath, and bedtime story. But now, everything had fallen apart. Her babysitter had called, her voice trembling. I can't make it tonight, Grace. The roads are flooded. I'm so sorry." Grace's stomach dropped. Mia and Noah couldn't be left alone. The roads were nearly impassable. Buses weren't running. And in the storm, leaving her children at home was unthinkable. She paced the halls of the mansion, her mop forgotten in the corner, her heart pounding. She had heard the stories about the billionaire who never allowed children in his home, the man who didn't tolerate noise, laughter, or joy. Yet the thought of leaving Mia and Noah in danger made her decision for her. With trembling hands, she scooped up their small backpacks and whispered, "We have to go. I'll take you with me, just for a little while." "Okay." Mia's wide eyes blinked at her. "But Mommy, won't he be mad?" "Sure, honey. Everything will be fine. I promise." Noah clutched her apron, his tiny hands sweaty with worry. "Mommy, is he scary?" "He's very serious," Grace admitted softly. "But sometimes, people who look scary just need a little light in their life." The twins didn't fully understand, but they trusted her completely. And so, against every rule she had promised herself to follow, Grace led them into the mansion. At first, the twins were quiet. They held onto her hand tightly, their small shoes echoing softly against the polished marble floors. The chandeliers above cast sparkling patterns on the walls, and the storm outside made everything feel surreal, like a scene from a fairy tale, though a very quiet, frozen one. Mia was the first to break the silence. She let go of Grace's hand and twirled once, twice, 3 times. Her little dress swirled around her legs. "I'm a princess," she whispered, her eyes bright with delight. Noah, ever the curious one, found the elevator buttons. He pressed one, then another, giggling as the panel beeped in response. Soon he was jumping and pressing them all, fascinated by the glowing numbers and lights. Grace tried desperately to hush them. "Please, babies." "Mr. Hale hates noise," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. But the twins' laughter and playful squeals had already begun to echo through the hallways, bouncing off the walls, reaching corners that hadn't heard a child's voice in years. Then it happened. A shadow appeared in the doorway. Richard Hale. The air seemed to freeze. The storm outside faded into silence in Grace's mind. She had expected anger, shouting, maybe even the firing of her entire career. But what met her eyes was far worse than anger. Richard stood tall, his face carved like a mask from stone. His eyes, cold and piercing, swept over the twins, over Grace, and finally rested on the marble floor as if weighing the gravity of her actions. What is going on here? The twins froze instantly, Mia's twirling stopping mid-step, Noah clutching the elevator panel like it was a lifeline. Grace felt her face drain of color. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "My babysitter, she canceled last minute. I'll take them right now." Richard didn't move. He didn't speak further. He simply stood there, as silent and imposing as a statue in the hall. The tension was unbearable. Grace could feel her heartbeat in her throat. The storm outside was now pounding harder, as if nature itself knew this moment was one of reckoning. Then something happened that no one could have predicted. Noah, small and fearless in a way that only children can be, stepped forward just a little. He tilted his head up, looked straight into Richard's eyes, and said softly, "You look sad." The room went utterly silent. Grace's mouth fell open. Mia's eyes widened. Even the wind seemed to pause. Richard Hale, the man who had never smiled, never allowed children inside his home, who had built walls around his heart taller than the mansion itself, didn't speak. His eyes softened slightly, though he didn't move. There was a flicker, almost invisible, of something long buried. Pain? Loneliness? Regret? Perhaps all three. Grace swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. She had never seen anyone, not even her own parents, cause him to pause like this. Mia, sensing the tension, took a tiny step forward. "Do you want to play with us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard blinked. Then he looked away. His jaw tightened, as though he were fighting some invisible battle inside himself. And yet, just like that, the ice began to crack. The sound of the storm outside, the echo of the twins' innocent voices, something had reached him. Something that reminded him of the wife he had lost, the family he had denied himself, the laughter he had once cherished and then buried in sorrow. Grace took a deep breath, her hands shaking, and whispered, "Sir, they only want to be near me. They won't cause trouble. Please." Richard didn't answer. He simply stepped back slightly, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. Noah's words had done what no argument, no tears, and no pleas could do. They had reached the man behind the mask. For the first time in years, Richard Hale didn't know what to say. And in that silence, something miraculous happened. The mansion felt warmer, softer, somehow alive again. Grace glanced down at the twins. They were staring up at him with wide, trusting eyes. They had no fear, only honesty and light. And Richard, standing there in the doorway, realized something he hadn't admitted in a decade. Maybe, just maybe, children weren't chaos. Maybe they were exactly what he needed. The storm raged on outside. But inside, for the first time in years, there was a spark of something new. The beginning of change. Richard should have fired her. That's what every employee expected. That's what the stories said he did in the past. One wrong move, one break in his carefully maintained silence, and the offender would be gone. Yet, as he stood in the doorway of the grand kitchen, watching Grace shepherd her small, innocent twins through the golden halls of the mansion, he did something no one anticipated. He didn't say a word about rules, discipline, or consequences. Instead, he simply said, "Let them stay until the rain stops." The words startled Grace so much that she nearly dropped the silver tray she was holding. Mia and Noah blinked up at her, puzzled, but quickly scurried toward the kitchen, their tiny feet making soft thuds on the marble floor. Grace followed, her heart racing, silently whispering, "Thank you, sir. Thank you." The twins immediately began exploring the kitchen, the only forbidden place in the house they had ever stepped foot into. Mia climbed onto a stool and grabbed a wooden spoon, pretending to stir a huge pot of invisible stew. Noah pressed buttons on the coffee machine, pretending it was a spaceship console, laughing as tiny bubbles popped in the frother. Grace tried to stop them at first, murmuring gentle warnings. "Please, babies, don't make a mess. Remember, Mr. Hale doesn't like noise." But the words barely reached them. And then it happened. A sound that had been missing in the mansion for 10 years. Laughter. Mia giggled as she swirled the spoon in the air, spinning around in her tiny princess-like twirls. Noah clapped his hands, snorting and laughing as he ran in circles. Grace, despite trying to shush them, began laughing herself, a soft, helpless laugh that seemed to echo off the marble walls. Richard froze in the doorway. The sound struck him like a lightning bolt, a strange, electric feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the noise of children playing. It was life. He blinked, then stepped closer, his heavy boots clicking softly on the marble floor. His expression softened as he watched the twins move freely in the kitchen, completely unafraid, completely joyful. Mia paused for a moment, noticing him at the doorway, and gave a small, shy smile. Noah waved his tiny hand enthusiastically, giggling. Grace whispered, almost apologetically, "They can't help themselves, sir. I'm so sorry." But Richard said nothing. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel something he had buried deep under grief, guilt, and loneliness, a tiny flicker of warmth in his chest, almost as if a long-lost part of himself had been awakened by their laughter. The twins continued playing, oblivious to the tension in the room. Mia began singing a little tune she had made up, humming softly, her voice echoing in the vast kitchen. Noah danced the rhythm, hopping from one foot to the other, and Grace clapped along, her own joy rising despite her fears. Richard stood there, watching, almost paralyzed. He felt something stirring in him, memories of Clara. He remembered the way she had laughed in this very kitchen, the way she had twirled in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. Memories he had kept locked away, thinking they were too painful to revisit, came rushing back in an instant. He realized suddenly that he had been living in a prison of his own making, walls of silence and control that had kept him safe from pain, but also robbed him of happiness. And here, standing in the doorway, were two small children, bringing life back into his home, without even trying. Later that night, the storm outside showed no sign of stopping. Thunder rattled the windows, and lightning cast fleeting shadows across the walls. Yet inside the mansion, a different kind of storm raged, one of feelings long suppressed, quietly breaking free. Mia and Noah had curled up on the couch near the fireplace, exhausted from their adventures. Their small bodies were still warm, and their soft breathing filled the room with a gentle rhythm. Grace sat beside them, brushing back Mia's hair, murmuring apologies. "I promise it will never happen again. I didn't mean to break the rules." Richard sat silently in a high-backed chair a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the twins. He didn't speak. He didn't scold. He didn't show anger. He simply stared, feeling emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself, "They can stay until morning." The words hung in the air like a fragile promise. Grace felt a wave of relief wash over her. She dared not speak again, just nodded and settled beside her children, feeling a quiet hope bloom inside her. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a golden glow across the kitchen. The twins stirred awake, rubbing their eyes, still sleepy but smiling. Grace moved toward them, ready to wake them for breakfast. But Richard's voice stopped her. "They can eat first," he said quietly, his tone calm, almost gentle. She froze. "Sir." "It's been a long time since this house smelled like pancakes," he said softly, almost as if the words were meant for himself more than anyone else. And that was when Grace realized something fundamental had changed. For the first time, the mansion that had been a place of order, silence, and sorrow was beginning to feel alive. The twins ate breakfast gleefully, chattering and laughing as Richard watched from the doorway, a small, almost shy smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't speak much, but he began to notice the little things, the smell of syrup mixing with the aroma of freshly baked bread, the bright eyes of the children, the gentle way Grace moved around the kitchen. That morning marked the beginning of everything. The walls of silence were beginning to crumble, brick by brick, replaced by warmth, life, and the unexpected magic that only children can bring. And Richard Hale, the man who had lived in grief for so long, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Days passed, and then weeks. What had begun as a single stormy night had grown into something entirely unexpected. The twins, Mia and Noah, started visiting the mansion more frequently. At first, it was just occasional, brief appearances after school or on weekends, hidden among the halls so no one would notice. But soon, Richard Hale found he no longer wanted them to hide. He watched quietly from his study window as Mia and Noah ran across the marble floors, their laughter bouncing off the walls like music he had forgotten existed. Noah was endlessly curious. He followed Richard everywhere, as if instinctively knowing that behind the billionaire's stern exterior was a man who had stories to tell, secrets to reveal, and maybe even wisdom worth listening to. "Why do you have so many paintings, sir?" Noah asked one afternoon, tugging at Richard's sleeve while they walked through the art gallery. Richard hesitated. Most people were afraid to ask him questions. Most people obeyed. But this child, this little boy, didn't flinch. "They're reminders," Richard said quietly. "Reminders of people I've known, places I've been, things I've lost." Noah tilted his head, thinking, "Do they make you sad?" Richard looked down at him. He hadn't expected the question. But in that moment, he realized it wasn't sadness he felt anymore. It was longing, hope. "They do," he admitted softly. "But sometimes, remembering isn't so bad when someone makes you smile again." Noah grinned. "Then maybe you need to remember more with us." Meanwhile, Mia had found her sanctuary in the mansion's expansive garden. While Noah explored the hallways and offices, Mia spent hours crouched near the fountain, carefully planting little flowers she had brought in tiny pots. She called the area Clara's Garden, naming it after a woman whose face she had never seen, yet whose presence seemed to whisper through the flowers. Richard noticed her one afternoon as he walked past the fountain, his cane clicking lightly on the stones. He paused, watching her hands gently pat the soil around each delicate bloom. "They're beautiful," he murmured. Mia looked up, her face lighting with a smile. "Thank you, sir. I think maybe she would like it too." Richard's chest tightened. The name Clara carried so much weight, so much grief. Yet hearing it spoken with innocence and hope made it feel lighter, almost as though his wife's memory was no longer a burden but a blessing. One afternoon, the most magical moment arrived. The ballroom, usually silent and empty, echoed with sound once again. Richard had been working late in his study when he heard the faint, clumsy sounds of piano keys being pressed. Curious, he followed the sound and found the twins at the grand piano. Mia banged the keys enthusiastically while Noah drummed on the side with his small hands. Their singing was off-key, their rhythm chaotic, but there was no mistake about it. Joy had returned to the mansion. Richard froze at the doorway, watching as his home, which had felt like a museum of sorrow, transformed before his eyes. Grace, standing nearby with a towel in her hands, froze as well. She had expected him to yell, to scold, to demand silence. But instead, he simply leaned against the doorframe and whispered, almost to himself, "Your children remind me of what I lost." Grace's eyes softened immediately. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Maybe, sir, they're here to remind you of what you still have." Richard looked at the twins, at their carefree laughter, at the sparks of life in their bright eyes. Something inside him shifted completely. He realized that happiness wasn't gone. It had simply been waiting for a reason to return. From that day on, everything changed. The mansion began to breathe again. The silence that had hung like a heavy curtain was replaced by laughter, footsteps, and music. Richard, who had once avoided his staff, now started hosting small dinners in the evenings. He invited the butler, the gardeners, the chefs, and the maids, not just to eat, but to share stories, jokes, and laughter. The mansion felt alive again, filled with warmth that no marble, chandelier, or golden fixture could ever replicate. He even began donating regularly to children's hospitals, doing so quietly, in Clara's name. The twins didn't understand it fully, but every letter from the hospital brought a smile to their faces, and Richard found joy in seeing that happiness ripple outward. Evenings became the most precious part of the day. Every night, before the twins returned home, Richard would sit with them in the cozy study or by the fireplace. They would tell him stories, stories they invented, stories from school, stories of dragons and heroes, of faraway lands and secret adventures. Sometimes he would ask questions, genuinely curious about their little world. Sometimes he would share old tales of his own childhood, tales he had never told anyone. And sometimes he would just sit quietly, listening, letting the laughter fill the emptiness that had once consumed him. The mansion, once a place of order and sorrow, had transformed into a home again. The echoes of children's laughter became the soundtrack of his life, a melody he had thought he would never hear again. Richard found himself smiling more than he had in years. Not just polite smiles or fleeting expressions of amusement, real smiles, deep and unguarded, born from connection, love, and the reminder that life could still be beautiful. And as he watched Mia place the final flower in Clara's garden, and Noah proudly show him the imaginary spaceship he had built out of chairs and cushions in the living room, Richard understood something he had long denied. Happiness wasn't something to earn or control. Happiness was something to welcome. And sometimes it arrived in the form of two small, fearless children who reminded him what it meant to live. One gray, overcast morning, Grace hurried through the gates of the Hale mansion. Rain had left puddles on the driveway, and the wind tugged at her coat. Her heart pounded harder than the storm outside. She had never been this late before. Every morning she arrived promptly, her children's routines balanced perfectly like clockwork. But today, nothing seemed under control. Her face was pale. Her hands trembled, clutching the handle of her bag as if it could steady her nerves. "The landlord, he's evicting us," she whispered to herself, barely able to hold back tears. "We have nowhere to go." The words felt heavier than the rain that battered the mansion walls. Mia and Noah, standing quietly beside her, looked up at her with worried eyes. Their tiny hands clutched her coat, their little hearts sensing something was wrong. Grace's voice shook as she spoke again. I don't know where we'll stay. I'm so sorry, babies." The twins didn't reply. They just hugged her legs, their innocent presence grounding her amid the panic. Inside, Richard Hale had already noticed her lateness. He was in the study, reviewing some papers, when he saw her arrive at the gates. At first, he thought she was simply late. But as he studied her expression, pale, tense, desperate, he felt a pang in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He stepped outside as Grace hurried up the driveway and noticed the twins' fearful eyes. Something in him shifted immediately. He didn't need to hear her words. The fear in their faces told the story. Without speaking, Richard turned back inside. He walked to the massive window overlooking the garden and took a deep, steadying breath. The mansion was quiet, almost reverent. For a long moment, it felt as though time itself held its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. Then he turned. He walked toward Grace with a calm yet commanding presence. The twins straightened slightly, unsure whether to run or stay. Grace opened her mouth to speak, but Richard stopped her. "Move in here," he said. Grace froze. She blinked, thinking she had misunderstood. "Sir, I couldn't," she stammered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Richard held up his hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. "You can, and you will," he said. His voice was calm, steady, and final. "This house was built for a family. I think. I finally have one again." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, and before she could even process his words, she dropped to her knees and embraced her twins. Mia clung to her shoulder, sobbing softly, while Noah buried his face into her coat, trembling with relief. Grace's tears fell freely, mixing with the rain that had soaked her hair. Richard stood a few steps back, watching silently, his chest tight with emotion. He had spent so many years shielding himself from pain, building walls to keep grief and love alike out. But now, seeing Grace and her children safe in his home, he felt those walls crumble. The days that followed were unlike anything the mansion had ever known. Every corner echoed with laughter. The marble floors, once polished and silent, now rang with tiny footsteps and playful squeals. Mia and Noah explored the rooms freely, their curiosity guiding them from the grand piano in the ballroom to the fountain in the garden. Richard, who had once avoided the world, began spending his mornings in the garden. He would watch the twins run barefoot through the grass, chasing butterflies, collecting leaves, and occasionally laughing so hard that their voices carried across the estate. The mansion, which had been a frozen monument to grief, began to feel alive again. Windows were thrown open to let in sunlight. Curtains swayed in the breeze. The smell of breakfast, pancakes, eggs, and fresh fruit filled the halls. Grace found herself smiling in a way she hadn't since before the eviction notice. Every morning, she would cook with the children at her side, telling them stories while Richard silently observed from the doorway, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. One afternoon, Richard wandered through the garden, his hands clasped behind his back. He watched Mia plant new flowers near the fountain, the one she had insisted be called Clara's garden. His chest tightened as he remembered his late wife, imagining her laughing beside the twins, alive in spirit if not in body. He knelt down beside Mia and asked softly, "Do you think Clara would like these flowers?" Mia looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "She'd love them, sir. I think she'd be proud of you, too." Richard felt tears sting his eyes, but he didn't move them. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel a profound, bittersweet joy, a mixture of loss and hope intertwined. Noah, meanwhile, had taken to exploring the mansion with quiet fascination. He loved asking questions about the paintings, the furniture, and even Richard's old office. Sometimes he would climb onto Richard's lap while the billionaire sipped tea, asking endless questions about the world outside, the cities and the stars. Richard answered them all, slowly realizing how much he had missed this connection, the innocence, the curiosity, and the simple, unfiltered wonder of childhood. Evenings became magical. The twins would curl up on the living room sofa, Grace sitting beside them, and Richard would tell stories of Clara, of the mansion in its glory days, and of adventures he had never shared with anyone. Mia and Noah would listen wide-eyed, sometimes interrupting with laughter, sometimes with thoughtful questions. Every night, as he watched them drift to sleep, Richard would look out at the darkened garden and whisper quietly, "Clara, I kept my promise. The house is full again." Those words, once impossible to say, now carried peace. The mansion, once a place of silence and sorrow, had become a home. Music, laughter, and love flowed through every corridor. The walls that had echoed only grief now resonated with life, warmth, and family. Richard Hale, the man who had once sworn he would never let children into his mansion, now realized the truth he had avoided for years. Happiness wasn't something to earn. It wasn't something to guard or control. It was something to welcome. And sometimes it arrived in the most unexpected forms, wrapped in the small hands of two fearless children and the courage of a kind-hearted mother. And so the mansion finally lived again, as a home, as a place of hope, and as a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Richard Hale's mansion, once filled with silence and sorrow, is now alive with laughter, love, and hope, all because one brave maid dared to bring her children into his world. Sometimes, the smallest hearts can teach the biggest lessons. If this story touched you, like, share, and subscribe. And never underestimate the power of love.